I just read this paper, Energy and Information. It's actually a Scientific American article from 1971. And it's talking about energy and information and how energy and information are related. I don't know if it says it in this paper, but energy and information are generally the same. They can be transformed into each other. It gives an example of X number of joules per degree Kelvin per year, or however many bits per second. So joules per degree Kelvin per year can be converted to bits per second. And I'm not exactly sure how this is relevant to my self-dialogue, but I just looked up the word entropy, and one of the definitions is lack of order or predictability, gradual decline into disorder. And in terms of physics, it's a thermodynamic quantity representing the unavailability of a system's thermal energy for conversion into mechanical work, often interpreted as the degree of disorder or randomness in the system. And I feel like, in a way, the process that I experience is like entropy of the ego. It goes towards disorder. And it does so not necessarily because that's a bad thing, but because there's so much tied up into the ego, it becomes a solid structure that really it's not. So it's bound to break down at some point. So the breakdown of that structure is actually part of a greater order. And in terms of energy, I've talked about how the ego is a waste of energy. And I feel like as it breaks down, there's more energy available. So then there's also more information available, because the information that the ego presents is often linear and repeating. So it's not new information. So when it breaks down, that structure that prevents new information, and it's actually in the way of the natural energy process of the brain, when it breaks down, that energy is available, so other information is available. And it seems confused and disordered, mainly because society is structured around the order of the ego, but it's not actually really natural order. It's contrived and educated order. So when that happens, that's when things like hallucinations or delusions or different meanings can come into play, mainly because now the brain is trying to establish this other order. It's a living order where truth arises moment to moment and has to be let go and not actually believed. Once it's believed, then it's actually attached to this ego structure that's going to start looping things. It's going to record something and remember it and believe it, when really it all has to be surrendered. And we all have these ordered egos, these separate me success structures, when really that needs to go into disorder in order for a different order of us actually cooperating with each other to arise. And it's like that disorder and that randomness in consciousness needs to happen in order for certain people to bounce up against each other and start cooperating. But normally what happens is a person is perceived as mentally ill and then put into that order of reality, which was not how that was meant to be classified in the beginning of that. And it says, today we know that it takes energy to obtain knowledge and that it takes information to harness energy. So the energy in our brain is tied up in our ego process. And because of that, we're not obtaining new knowledge. We're not really learning much of anything. And so when that structure breaks down, we're all of a sudden able to learn again. And a lot of this is disordered, and meaning is attached to things that don't have as much meaning as they feel like in the moment, and so-called hallucinations and delusions. But really, it's the brain trying to start to learn how to learn and how to acquire different knowledge and make other meanings than the ones that we've been programmed to make and just repeat all the time. And it says it takes information to harness energy. So once we've got this way larger context and spectrum and perspective and map to understand things, we can then actually, as our consciousness unfolds, as our process of perception continues, we can actually harness different energy because we have access to different information. And then this goes along with what I was saying with how the manic state is sort of like a hyper learning state. It's a vision casting state. It's rich and full of information, and that's why it's important to go back and harvest it in retrospect. That's why there's so much more energy. That's why one doesn't need sleep. It's like a person is connected to that field of energy and information and able to transform it and translate it. But then it comes to an end at some point, and then a person is labeled with a mental illness. But it's important to go back to that energy and that information that one was able to connect with and gather in that state, because it's like being propelled into that state, but we can actually go back and harvest that information and move towards embodying that and perceiving that and creating that and unfolding that in daily life. And I feel like that's why it was sort of given to us. That's why that extra energy state was given to us. It's sort of a gift, and then it's sort of our own game to unfold it and make sense of it. We're put into a game of, here's your mental illness, now recover, instead of, here's your vision, now rediscover and recreate your life. And so we can create a different game from our vision cast and harvest it and practice it and embody it differently. It was extra information, it was extra meaning, and we are the ones that make meaning. We are the meaning makers, and we can choose to make any meaning we want out of it. We can interpret it in any way we want, and by interpreting it as mental illness, we walk down that path. We can interpret it as, I'm here to save the world, or I'm here to save my family, or I'm here to save myself, or I'm here, whatever it is, I'm just here to be in the moment and see what happens. There's no real right or wrong. And we can change the game anytime we want. It's like, what are we going to do with that information? And it's a process. It's an information processing process. And so many of us start processing information in similar ways, like seeing visions, hearing voices, feeling like we're getting special messages. All this array of apparent symptoms, which is different information processing and gathering, and we're learning from ourselves and from our experience and from our past and everything in each moment unfolding. And it totally burns us out. It's like we burn up all our energy by going into that process, but then we can still move towards embodying that which we were to start with in that process. We have it within us to be that version of ourselves, of processing information. That whole experience creates the context and the spectrum and the perspectives and the map for which we can sense and start to move towards that which we were, which we are now, which we just can't necessarily sense and feel, but in our daily life and in our daily actions, as we work on embodying that, we see that we are that already. And so many wisdom traditions, they say, well, you're perfect as you are now. And we're like, well, yeah, right, how can that be true? But when we've connected with mania, we actually feel like we are perfect as we are in each moment, no matter what's happening. And so we do have that within us. So there's proof when we've already lived that proof. And we've already lived the proof that we can create whatever game we want to live in life, and we shouldn't be limited by the game that we've been told that we're supposed to believe is how things are for us. They talk about information and probabilities, and it's a little bit complicated in a way, but what I like is they say that information can be defined as anything that causes an adjustment in the probability assignment. And they're talking about the probability of a certain answer to a question. So if I think, okay, the question is, do I have a mental illness? And now all the possible answers are different probabilities. Well, with what I'm talking about with myself, it's information to me in that it's changing the probability of me actually thinking, yes, I do have a mental illness. So the more and more I talk about that question in self-dialogue in different ways, the less likely it is for me to actually have the probability of seeing it as that one particular answer. Each time I make a statement to myself about it, I'm actually making the probability smaller and smaller and smaller. Yet if I was to always be talking about myself in terms of that, then the answer to the question would be, well, yes, I do, because I always am saying these sentences about it, this information that is showing that that is true. And they talk about thermodynamics in terms of a transformation or a conversion between thermal and mechanical energy. And mechanical energy is movement, thermal energy is heat. And there could be something to do with heat and energy and something. Somebody called me from MasterCard and I was like, I don't qualify for your premium card. And they're like, oh, but you qualify for premium number 2. I'm like, okay, fine, I'm listening. And I just said some stuff and then I was like, okay, sure, send me the card. So this paper goes on to say that the information content of a message then is a measure of the change in the observer's knowledge from knowledge X before the message to knowledge X prime after the message. A message that tells you what you already know produces no change in either knowledge, X remains the same, or in the probability assignment, and therefore conveys no information. And I think that's interesting because I think that's interesting because here I am talking to myself, and some of the stuff I already know I want to say or talk about. But then when I keep talking about it, I say something else that I had no idea I was going to say. So it's actually new information because I've never heard it before. And also too, I imagine if someone ever watches this, one might actually change one's own knowledge about oneself or what one thinks about oneself, because I feel like what I'm saying is something different than what a person might say and actually absorb as knowledge given the dominant paradigm. And one thing it doesn't touch on with that statement there was that I was given new information when I was given a diagnosis and I was given psychoeducation. But I never really believed it. But it did still change my knowledge in that I knew that that information was out there as part of the paradigm. And I still did utilize some of the knowledge because it's difficult not to when it's the dominant paradigm. I gave the example before of how I could have said, I'm not mentally ill, and, ran away and crossed the border and never to be seen again. But by staying and taking the medication, in a way, I sort of was like acting as if I am. I would say, I said to myself in my own mind, in a way, sure, I can play the role of mentally ill person. It's sort of like the role that I had to play being put into and subjected to that paradigm. If I would have said, I'm not mentally ill, that would have been further proof that I was mentally ill. So the only way to get out of it was really to just play along with it. And it wasn't just playing along as in faking, because I definitely have had experiences and supposed symptoms along the way that it's true. So it is true, but it's not true to me at the same time. Like, I feel there's a different context through which to describe it. And me having that context in my heart and mind helps me get through it. If I just felt like, oh, I was mentally ill, and I believed it, then I probably wouldn't really try to thrive at all. It's sort of like how perhaps a homeless person might go to some kind of Christian program in order to get food and shelter or something. Doesn't mean they have to be Christian. It's just the Christian people are the ones that are offering the food and shelter, for example. And because I've had supposed mental health symptoms, which could be translated and described in so many different ways, which I've probably talked about some of them in these last hours and hours of talking about it to myself, I end up going for help to the mental health paradigm because it's there, and that's sort of the dominant system of helping people with that stuff. I remember the first time I was in a crisis, I tried to fake my own death by just kind of playing dead and hoping I would die and wake up somewhere else. But in my mind, I sort of felt like I need to fake my own death to get out of here, to escape. But instead, because I did that, it appeared as if I was mentally ill. And now it's like I have to fake being mentally ill in order to escape the mental illness paradigm. And it's not that I'm actually faking it. I have had so many horrific experiences. It's almost like maybe the universe is faking it for me. I'm not sure how it works. And I could be faking it too, in terms of how I had a pretty traumatic experience like 5-6 months before all this happened, and I had to sort of fake certain aspects of things in order to survive that. I felt like if I didn't fake certain things, then I might be killed. And then now it's like, oh, I tried to fake my own death, and now it's like I'm faking mental illness. Not that I'm actually faking it, but it's like, it's not real in a way. It was a result of that original fake and not really dealing with all that. So in a way, I'm still like, I don't know, it's a weird sensation. I guess it feels fake in that it's not really a mental illness. Like, it was trauma. It was all this other stuff that comes to this apex that appears as a mental illness. So that's part of the fake too. And in a way, the ego is fake. And I'm on medication that helps me function as this ego. And that's kind of fake. And then I'm working in the mental health system, which is a big fake, not actually dealing with what's really troubling people and letting it get to the point where someone's so distressed that it's just called, oh, your own mental illness and nothing else related to that. And related to that, that article that I read by Ron Unger talking about psychosis, and he was being critical of this thing called Navigate. And I don't know anything about it, but he says that that program would say, psychosis is nobody's fault. People do not cause it. And Ron says, wow, really? Nobody does anything to cause psychosis? Meaning like trauma, nothing, abuse, nothing causes psychosis? It's nobody's fault? And that's just another excuse to just say, oh, it just happens, it's your brain, you take your medications and be good now, because nothing caused it. And that's a load of horse manure. And that's what I'm talking about in terms of my own experience, is there was so much that led up to this label of psychosis that is fake, in that all the actual real bits that led up to it never supported, led up to this thing called psychosis. So I actually feel like there's something with this whole entropy thing, with this transformation of energy. It's like there's this energy in our body, stored in our body, or stored in our being, and that's sort of the allostatic load, and it's stagnant, and the energy needs to flow, and then all of a sudden there's this huge release of energy and information, and it's all muddled together, and that's sort of so-called psychosis, but it's something that needs to be released. It's like this entropy in consciousness, this thermodynamic energetic transformation process, and is trying to get us to process things in a different way, not in terms of our own ego. I think there's some kind of entropy in consciousness going on. And it says, just as the entropy of information has meaning only in relation to well-defined questions, so the entropy of thermodynamic analysis has meaning only in relation to a well-defined system. And it says that a gain in entropy is a loss in information. I think a gain in entropy is more disorder. So more disorder means less information because it's more disordered. And I think of the ego breaking apart as sort of a gain in entropy, and so that would be a loss in information. But I think when that is broken up, there's actually an entirely different system of information processing that comes in, because the ego information processing is an entropy, or is this information system that is actually false. So when it breaks up, this more natural way of processing information can actually come in. And it talks about how if we already know something, then no actual information is there. It's nothing new, and that to me relates to how the ego goes in circular loops. And it talks about how if no information is processed, then there's no energy available. So we're not really processing anything, so there's no energy available. So we're each sort of our own closed loop. And if we're a closed loop, then that energy is not actually available to the greater system. And I think in that way we've been turned into machines. And they talk about by providing a departure from equilibrium, it becomes a source of information and useful energy. And I think that's what's happening in consciousness in a person that goes into map consciousness or trans consciousness, is it's away from the ego equilibrium, which provides different information and different energy, in that a person is going to do different things. And it talks about how the energy of the sun gets stored in clouds and lakes and things. Well, I feel like the energy is also stored in human beings. And I've talked about how now more and more energy and consciousness is actually into the biomass of humanity. But if we're not actually processing information and learning, we're more like stagnant pools than actual sources of flux and flow of energy and information. We're not the source of creating energy and information from the energy. We're not thermodynamically transforming our biomechanical energy into new information. We're just actually consuming old information and not really learning much that's new. And so we're not contributing back to the cycle of information and learning.